Our second presentation on day one, it's really an exciting pleasure to have both Ben and Tom from AstraZeneca to talk a little bit more about their data-centric journey from an oncology perspective. So, Ben and Tom, take it away.
Hello, my name is Ben Gardner. I'm here with my colleague Tom Plasterer, and we're going to be talking to you about the data-centric journey that AstraZeneca R&D has been working on. Just to kick us off, thank you. So a little history to start off with of what data-centricity at AstraZeneca R&D has been. It really breaks down into three main projects. The first is around Clinical Data Hub, also referred to in this slide deck as AZCT or AstraZeneca Clinical Trials. This was an approach to try and overcome the fragmentation that was associated with our clinical study information. Clinical studies are a complex beast, and they're run by 5 to 10 sort of transactional systems that capture the operational management and execution of a clinical study. And in addition to this, there were a couple of knowledge bases as well. As you can well appreciate, information was federated, was scattered across all these sources, and the need was to bring it together into a consistent data type. Specifically, they look to use the standard pattern that Dave and others have spoken about already around data with a federation over the top of those sources, some sort of ontology model to bring it together, APIs, and then UIs to expose the data. The approach was built around the 5-star linked data principles of Sir Tim Berners-Lee. Central to that was the use of HTTP-based URIs to identify things, and to provide human and machine readable APIs to surface that data. In addition, the knowledge base contained cross-references to external ontologies. So we had an ontology for clinical trial, AZ trial ID, and AZ product, so the products, the drugs that we work on. This was actually developed using the tool called Composite or Cisco Information Server that some of you may be familiar with. This is a relational technology that uses virtualization. So you construct your federated query based around a relational model. That project produced some great artifacts, specifically entity ontologies for study and drug. So we had canonical definitions of those with all of the instances with URIs. And as I said, those cross-reference to external sources so that the other ontologies could be used to integrate back into it. But the issue was it was relational construct, and therefore it was challenging to scale and certainly to evolve as we wanted to add other things in there. At a similar time, there was also work going on in the integrated informatics part, which was being led by Tom, we'll speak more about this later. This was an approach that, again, used federation of linked data over data sources to bring the data together. It was based around using both relational to RDF technologies as well as curated triple store to bring that information together. The approach was to start focused. I think Dave would refer to this as starting small, but it was starting focused, and it was focusing on transactional medicine and the use cases that they specifically had. But whilst doing that, there was that continuous thought of what does this take to scale up? What can we middle out? How can we build on these individual use cases to deliver value? And that led to this creation of a core ontology, if you like, an enterprise ontology, but focused around science. And this was relating key concepts like drug, indication, target, clinical study, and subjects that participated in that study together. And it became apparent that that was a common core that could be reused again and again and again. Artifacts that came out of this project was a nice, clear URI policy, some real clear understanding of fair data principles, and also experience of using enrichment of structured and semi-structured data using named entity recognition. But the challenge here was that this was developed outside of IT, and we can all appreciate the challenges that can be associated with bringing projects that were not built in IT back into a large IT organization. So the final one is the Scientific Data Foundation. This was really kicked off about 2 years ago now, and it's a classical data lake project. It was there to enable the creation of fair data, to enable data scientists to run machine learning and artificial intelligence like insights off of the existing data sets within AstraZeneca. Like all good lake designs, it had a capture and ingest, a collect, a conform, a connect, context, analytics, and consumes layer. Lots of nice layers, one after another. And it was driven by relational thinking. Having said that, there were some really good artifacts that were coming out of that. The RDM strategy was really based around ontologies. It wasn't just a controlled vocabulary type scenario. It was really quite, some good infrastructure has been put in place around that. The business had started to understand the principles of FAIR and was starting to use that in their language. So there was buy-in on that. And they were making real investments in terms of resources, people who were actually put into roles inside the data office and within data governance to drive those standards back into the organization. But one thing to note, on this layered chart, knowledge graph does exist, but it's hidden somewhere in that analytics column, and it does not exist within the context. So one of the first things that came along was that the conversation had become stuck. The problem was that people had a view, or at least a number of senior people had a view, that there was going to be one AstraZeneca graph. And it was mired in a conversation of label property graph versus RDF graph. And it risked really descending into a typical religious war around that. So the thing that I looked to do was to introduce new language, and that was to talk about knowledge maps, something that allowed people to explore and navigate around the information space, and to try and separate this from analytical knowledge graphs, which were around driving insight using the machine learning side of things. And this isn't really the purpose here wasn't to create a technical specification or say there was a technical difference between them. It was to create mind space and allow people to move beyond that one graph thinking. It allowed us to comfortably position knowledge maps within that context layer in the lake. Essentially, what we're doing is introducing a federation here based around that core ontology. And the analytical knowledge graphs, domain ontologies, can be more, at least psychologically, positioned within that analytics layer. Creating this separation allowed that communication to actually move on and allowed people to rethink the way that they were approaching it, and was important in us moving forwards. So having done the theory, the challenge to us was to show what this new world, this use of these knowledge maps would enable us to do. And we took the artifacts from those previous approaches and combined them together using that data sources, federation, ontology, and a UI pattern that we're also familiar with. The first source we included was the AstraZeneca clinical trials to bring in study and drug data. We supplemented that with competitor intelligence information from Sightline. And this had been created as a Sparkle endpoint over a Allegro graph data triple store containing that data that Tom and the integrated informatics team had previously created. This enabled us to enhance the records of our internal studies with additional information that was reported through the regulatory reporting requirements. In addition to that, we extracted data out of our clinical trials data to identify things like the adverse events that occurred in each clinical trial and the lab codes, the measurements, blood pressure, eosinophil counts, etc., that were made to each subject in that trial. What we generated was profile data, so it wasn't about individual subjects, but it told you the number of times, say, an adverse event occurred in that clinical study. In that process, we did enrichment, so we applied clinical standards, aligned across the studies, and also ensured that we had the AZT, that standardized ID for clinical study in there as our key join. And imaging, well, again, that was about exposing, what image modalities, so MRI, CT scan, X-ray, had been performed during the study, how many images we had of each type, and which part of the body had been scanned. And the purpose was to bring all that together through a virtual knowledge map using a tool called leap analysis. And then we showed that we could expose outputs from that data into various outputs. So Discover, a semantic search engine, Spotfire, BI tool, Jupyter, etc. So by bringing that data together, we were able to start to ask questions that no one solution could do, and it allowed people to ask that in a relatively straightforward fashion. So as a scientist, an actual use case was, I need to search for oncology clinical studies where interstitial lung disease was observed as an adverse event, and CT images of the chest were taken. So that's combining data from AZCT, from the CDI, that adverse event data, and data from the imaging, for example. And we exposed that in a number of, illustrated that we could expose information in response to those sorts of questions in a number of ways. One was to actually do a population of a semantic search platform. And in this case, we output the data as canonical entities. So one file for study with all of the data associated to that in terms of both the attributes and the relationships, and then loaded that into that search platform, allowing people to find and form queries of the form that are previously discussed and are in the title. Another example is to create a large flat file output, which we were then able to load into a business intelligence tooling template, again, allowing people to interactively filter and explore the data. And finally, the third use case that we demonstrated was one around verification or cleaning up of data. So we had a set of self-reported dirty data with all the usual problems that you get in Excel spreadsheets created that way. What we're able to do was to import that into a Jupyter notebook, construct a query in there that ran against our knowledge map, the data source that we'd created, and then produce an output which was to enrich that data now with the authoritative standardized naming for the various entities that existed, as well as add in additional information, for example, which clinical studies had actually got imaging data of a particular type available for them. Now that's really is a background and is where we've got up to. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tom to talk about more about this focused, focused scale out strategy that he has developed. Tom?
Oncology, translational medicine, data strategy within AstraZeneca. I'm a systems biologist by training, bioinformatician by training. I've been in the linked data life science community for a number of years, which has evolved into the fair data community and trying to bring a lot of these efforts inside the company. And so one of the main things that I'm trying to do is really to get one of our major therapeutic areas, translational medicine and oncology, to start thinking in system-centric, in data-centric ways. System-centric is how they have been doing it for a very long time. So if we think about what this means in the life science community, we'll have applications that are built around major technologies such as digital pathology, next-generation sequencing, or biomarkers. And they're really built when there's a new scientific data type that we need to bring together and incorporate. So very much built for a purpose. Typically, there's a new company that spins out of a scientist's lab that has some domain expertise that will then spin up a new application on the web and develop a new product. And so they're pretty good within that domain. I mean, they're built for a purpose within, say, taking advantage of next generation sequencing and all of the subsequent downstream technologies. So when they do that, however, there is some metadata, some concepts that they're going to develop within their application, such as clinical data, image data, transcript data, drug data, and they're going to work just within that application. They're really only intended to work within that application. And so you can note from the different icons that they're not really intended to work across, or at least interoperability and reuse is not really what you've heard that saying many times over the course of this series of meetings. And that's very much true for scientific applications as well. And so frequently the way around this is just to build an application API. And so the thought is that, all right, so at least you're going to be able to get some of that data out by generating this API, but you really have just moved the problem. You haven't changed it. You still need an expert to help you with this, whether it's a developer, an engineer, or an architect. So picking up on this point, the APIs are not enough. They're very much of a narrow pipe. It's designed by the developer for a limited subset. And if you wanted to really treat everything as if it was just one source of data underneath it, one connected source of data, it really can't be done. So that's the challenge. And we want to be able to make it so that all of our data that we have within translational medicine is usable across all of our systems for all sorts of interesting questions, not just the ones that show up within each of these application silos. How do we switch that? How do we make it so that translational medicine within oncology, which itself sits between discovery and clinical, how do we get them to start thinking in a system-centric, or away from a system-centric way of doing things, away from application-centric into a data-centric view of the world? And so if you think about a not theoretical search application, it'll start off wanting to do a cross-system search for a term such as non-small cell lung cancer, or NSCLC as it's frequently referred to. And if you go ahead and click to the advanced. And so this will look within a particular data type to see where that term appears, usually as a label on top of a URI across all of these different data types, such as clinical data, imaging data, drug data, genomics data, and so forth. And because we've set this up at the bottom of the search, you don't really have to know what expert to talk to about where that data lives. You just sort of need these rough criteria to be able to get started. And so then what this will do is it will take this search and federate it across the data layer using our core ontology that Ben alluded to earlier. And the way that we're able to get this sort of efficiency is because we've already harmonized the data using harmonized semantics, using the same vocabularies in a fair data, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable way. And so because we're using common URIs across these sources, and because we're using a limited number of community-approved vocabularies, we're able to share our semantics across these different sources. And then what this then does is it draws them straight from the source applications which were formerly silos. So the digital pathology application is going to be your authoritative source where we master the digital pathology data. The NGS application, again, for genomics and variant data or epigenetics or data above the genome. And our biomarker application is going to have different types of biomarkers in it. And so we're actually communicating and federating straight through with those with the shared semantics. And so you're able to both support mastering the data in authoritative source, as well as any reference data management for ways of describing things across those sources. And so the nice thing about when you do this and when you're able to pull from source that way is you're now able to kind of go sideways across all of these different sources in this middle layer. And this is in essence your knowledge graph. And so by doing this connectivity across sources, you're not only respecting everything that you need to do around the authoritative sources, but you're setting up a knowledge graph, a federated knowledge graph. And so that allows you to do some really, really interesting cross-query cross-system queries for some very complicated biological questions. So this came out of, I think it was Ben's second slide, talking about the integrative informatics program and kind of what we learned as we started thinking about using both the datathon technique and use cases, or reuse cases, as we sometimes refer to them, as the basic process for how we get started here. We don't want to build anything, especially since I'm coming at it from a science perspective, that's not of immediate tangible value to the scientists. I mean, they're not going to be patient for a waterfall approach, so you have to keep them engaged with really quick turnaround on their scientific questions. And you do that, then you can get them to really start to think more data-centric and participate with this exercise on better data stewardship. So that's really the first thing that we have to do, is take their business question and capture it in a semi-formal to formal way so that we can really begin to understand it and to model it and to get a good sense of how we're going to capture all these questions and make sure they're aligned to science that needs to be solved. And from that point on, what we do is build some very small extensible models. And these are sometimes referred to as application ontologies, but they're just kind of a way to model that question. Then we build a formal ontology off of the informal model, Frequently, the informal model can be driven by domain experts that know nothing about ontologies, and the formal one is where we bring in our ontologists. And then we do the transform or the mapping step. And if we're able to do this correctly, it's mostly just a mapping step. We're able to take our source data, map it through with that model, and then end up with semantic, usually it's linked data type approach that will satisfy that business question. Frequently, this is also where you find out that your model is insufficient or the question you didn't quite capture it wrong. You have to go back a few steps. But this is the beginning of showing how you make that transformation into either these connector mapping wrapping tools or an ETL process. Assuming you pass this next step, you enrich it. And so this is also, this is something we refer to as verification, but this is where you make sure that your entities and the URIs that you're using are also cross-mapped to any public URIs that you might want to use from authoritative public sources. And this is also where you want to take advantage of any public vocabularies to make sure that your semantics and your concepts are as reusable as possible. And so this is frequently referred to as either enrichment or verification, and is starting to be a fairly common practice within the industry. This is also where you begin to think about putting quality control. If you're doing semantics, pure semantics, you can think about a shackle type approach to validating this data. And this is also where you want to populate data sets coming through into a formal data catalog using something like a DCAT approach. Then we want to QA/QC the verified data sets and come up with a publication path. And here publication is really to the consuming application, which could be anywhere from the Discover app that's shown here, or Spotfire, Jupyter, wherever. It just really depends on the use. And then one of the things that we really like to do is put the data into a faceted browser. It gives us a chance to do this faceted browser over federated knowledge graph approach just to see how everything hangs together. And then instead of building applications, we're just configuring them. And that's a heck of a lot faster. And then all your artifacts go back into the process so that you can learn from them and hopefully shorten this path. One of the things with this, and one of the things with the way that my team and Ben's team interact, you want to make sure that this isn't just a game of whack-a-mole. It's not just one use case after another after another. You want, the first time you do this is usually fairly costly, fairly painful. You have to get the teams up to speed on how this is done and how to think and graph. But once you go through that cycle again, it's sometimes just as easy as a small extension to that graph. And so it can be much, much quicker once you go around the cycle a couple of times. So part of that is taking advantage of what you've already built. Part of it's getting your people to think in this way. A part of it's having this steel thread use case that gets you there all the way around the cycle the first time so that you can understand the impact. And it starts with that prioritized use case. It starts with some of these artifacts that we already have in place, such as resolvable URIs, the URI policy, the QA/QC service. And then when you're done, you've solved the business question, you've updated data model, you've got a new process in place, and so forth. So that's really how we're able to kind of go from the small focused scientific questions all the way to something that can layer and grow and be used for bigger and bigger questions and more use. So I think I'm going to bring Ben back in, or ask if Ben can be brought back in so we can talk a little bit about how we're going to do this together and kind of how the science side and the therapeutic area side works with more of the R&D IT side. And so if it's possible to have both of us and the slide up, that's fantastic. If not, I think Ben and I can probably just speak to it.
Yep.
But yeah, some of the things that we've found that have been really beneficial to this is once you go through this cycle, the first couple of times, it's a much shorter development path. Once you've got a team that can take advantage of some of these artifacts that are built, whether it's the QA/QC service, whether it's the enrichment service, whether it's the URI policy, once that's started, that can go quite a bit quicker and can be used to address many more scientific questions. There's a bunch of places where, because it's got this quick cycle, you are pulling in the domain experts, and they're not waiting months and months and months to see something. They're able to see the results of their questions in a very short period of time. And so we can keep them engaged, and especially if we're talking about configurable dashboards over graphs. We can roll out a new one of those in a matter of a couple of weeks. They can directly see how they can structure the data for their use or for their use cases. one of the really nice effects that we start to see is that when multiple different groups are using this, we can take advantage of each other's models as well as each other's visualization templates. And that's really, really powerful. So if we think about one of the use cases that we're looking at within oncology, my team in translational medicine might be concerned about trial operations and patient recruitment around, and that's guided by, say, a particular biological marker that is going to tell us that we're going to have patients that are likely to respond to a particular drug, and looking at studies in that space. And so say we're looking at 4 or 5 internal studies that are in that same space. Because we're in the knowledge graph looking at space around these 4 or 5 clinical studies, we can quickly pivot for other related questions from other communities. And so our competitive intelligence community might want to say, oh, okay, well, these are the 4 really key studies. Maybe what we want to do at this point is look at competitors around this space. Who else has a compound that's going to be in our space, or potentially collaborators if we're talking about sort of big multi-arm basket trials. And so you can pivot right into that because the data model allows you to do that. And again, that's leveraging both FAIR and recognizing federation from other sources. So Ben, you want to talk a little bit about the scaling and how that comes together?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. From my side of the shop, what I've got to try and do is to build that infrastructure, that skill set that exists around this space. And a lot of this, the tooling is pretty, we're pretty confident of what we need. We're seeing the demand grow. We have seen multiple platforms wanting to use it, in addition to the therapeutic projects of the type Tom described. We're seeing multiple platforms wanting to utilize this data. We're seeing conversations that are going on, and this comes back to the language point, and finding ways to fit this and blend it with the existing architecture that exists. The data mesh piece that's come out of ThoughtWorks around how to move beyond monolithic data lakes is a great example. When I read it, I say, well, data products, well, that's my sources. Mesh, well, that's my federated query. It's interesting. Steps all fit within a reference architecture. One of the key things I see as the challenge to myself is how do we democratize this information that we've pulled together beyond the high priest, the skilled RDF semantic expert? How can we make it so that people can operate with and leverage this data within, say, a data science toolkit? Ideally, how can we move this beyond the person needing to be a data scientist? It's a data citizen that we're actually serving. And I think Tom alluded to the whack-a-mole problem, the risk that we end up with just a complete Tower of Babel around our models. And that's one of the key things that we're starting to really work on really early in our journey here, as we start to pull people together. It's to bring the business groups together, and it's not just the research, the therapeutic areas, and the data science in those areas, but also the information architects and the data office to bring that together. And we're looking to put together an ontology architecture as a way of putting governance over these models and driving those extensions that people identify in their projects, and how we can drive this back into a common whole to continually advance ourselves. Not trying to create a straitjacket, but trying to create flexible components that add to it. Skills, training, capacity are just the usual ones. So we're in the early maturity. We've certainly moved beyond the use cases and the fantastic work that Tom and Kirsten and others did in the past, and where we are starting to put this together as a cognate whole and trying to get it to land comfortably within the wider IT organization. And I think that's really where we are up to. We are maturing. It's getting adoption. And I think the key one is to move to our next slide and just thank everyone who did this, because whilst Tom and I are the face of this, it's an army of people who have supported us and influenced us throughout this journey. So thank you very much to everyone, and thank you to Dave and the rest of Semantic Arts for the opportunity to speak at this Data-Centric conference. Thank you.
My thanks as well.